Welcome to Visionary Voices. This podcast aims to explore the stories of my friends who are blind or visually impaired from their perspective. Feel free, if you wish, to grab your beverage of choice, sit back, relax, and enjoy the stimulating conversation. Okay, welcome to episode 4 of Visionary Voices. My guest this time is John McCann. John, go ahead and give listeners a brief introduction.
Jessica, first off, it's a pleasure to be on your podcast. As Jessica said, my name is John McCann. I was born in September 1954. I was congenitally blind from congenital glaucoma. I had a tiny bit of vision in my left eye. I think that if I somehow miraculously had sight restored, I would recognize quite a few colors. I had to hold them up very close to my face. But, that pretty much died off. By the time I was 7 or 8, I really had nothing left. Light perception, and even that went down the tubes by the time I was 11. I went to a school for the blind. I was born and raised in New York City, so I went to Lavelle School for the Blind. It was a Catholic elementary school at the time that I started, run by the Dominican nuns of Blauvelt, New York. And when I entered 8th grade, they started adding on a high school. So I would have been in the second graduating class had I stayed. But I really wanted, after 8 years of being in that very empowering environment where I really got my blindness skills, Braille literacy, use of slate and stylus, and the adaptive equipment we used for mathematics, arithmetic, etc. I wanted a mainstreamed environment. Plus, whenever somebody who had graduated from Lavelle's elementary school went back on a day when maybe they had vacation, but we didn't, went back to visit the school, they were like paraded as though they were the ultimate in, quote, having made it, close quote. So that was well inculcated into my thinking. And even though there was a high school, and even though I think Lavelle would have very much wanted me to stay, I wanted to go to a mainstream Catholic high school environment, and I did. I went to Christ the King High School in Middle Village. I graduated valedictorian as it happened. After that, I did a year at Manhattan College, but it was not as much of a residential college as I had hoped it would be, or if I'm being frank, I think this was before I attended a Syracuse program for orientation to college life in a residential setting. And so I don't think I had the confidence, and I sort of wanted to be resident at a college, but not too far away from home. Well, Manhattan College really wasn't a good fit for me, so I transferred to the State University of New York at Binghamton, and that's where I completed my degree. I was Phi Beta Kappa, then went on to Harvard Law School, graduated there in 1980, and that's the beginning history. Worked for the government for 4 years, then worked basically in the blindness field as the executive director of a very small lobbying organization that sought to be a consortium of the Blind Veterans Association, National Industries for the Blind, ACB, American Council of the Blind, the American Foundation for the Blind. Basically, it was everybody but the National Federation, as they were leery of coalitions and remain so. Then I was tapped to be the commissioner for the Virginia's state agency for the blind. And I did that for 3 3/4 years. I can't say that was overly successful. In fairness to me, I suppose, one would have to say that I really had no managerial experience, but the governor was bent on removing the fellow who was there. The incoming governor was Gerald Beliles, and he definitely wanted a change out there, and he saw me as the change, and I decided to grab the brass ring. But, I mean, we did some good things, but there was seemingly constant tension between myself and the person who I reported to, the Secretary for Health and Human Resources. So I can't say that was overly successful, and I went back to government service, and for the remainder of my 24 years in government, from 1990 to 2014, I was with the Social Security Administration. I was a law clerk to a stable of administrative law judges making disability determinations. We think of disability as sort of cut and dry, and that's true in the case of so-called listing level disabilities. In other words, if you have condition X, you're determined to be disabled by that fact alone. But a lot of disability is adjudicated not only because you have a medical condition, but does that in fact prevent you from doing any kind of work? So we look at educational, vocational, and age. Those are factors taken into account where the decision is not automatic based on the disability itself. So that's probably more of an answer than you or your listeners may want to know. But
Wow, that's incredible. Can you share your journey and what inspired you to become an advocate for the visually impaired community?
Yeah, that's not too difficult a question. Of course, once I had graduated from Lavelle, I put graduation in quotes, it is a graduation, but from the 8th grade, okay? So I went to Christ the King, as I mentioned, and there I was definitely all about integration. Some blind people one in particular mistakenly thought that, I thought I was better than other blind people. That was not at all the case, but I figured I could have stayed at Lavelle if I just wanted to be in an all-blind environment. And Christ the King gave me opportunities I never would have had. I did reference the fact that I was fortunate enough to have graduated valedictorian, and I don't think it takes a lot of introspection to appreciate that being the valedictorian in a class of 325 sighted folks is maybe a different order of magnitude beyond being valedictorian if you have 30, in a class of 30 blind people. I'm not saying that to pat myself on the back, but over and above the academics, and I got a great education there, I was in folk club, I was in student council, and I think after maybe the first few months of freshman year, people weren't as weirded out by my blindness. That's not a real elegant way of putting it, but there was less trepidation, and a real icebreaker was the fact that I played guitar. Guitar is a real passion of mine. We can get into that a little later. But especially when I joined folk club, I was really respected as a guitarist, and people, the blindness just became just another part of who I was, but not an overarching or a part that defined me so rigidly. I mean, beyond not being able to see things, and that's a big beyond, but in a way it isn't. I have the same teenage thoughts, aspirations, and have talents like any other person. Going from there, especially once I decided I wanted to be an attorney, while going through law school, I never had the idea that I was going to be an attorney that made a career out of disability rights, and disability rights were just coming to the fore. I mean, it was 10 years after my graduation from law school that the ADA was passed. So my graduation from law school predated the current regulatory and statutory framework for addressing disability rights. But I knew once I got out of law school, my dear friend Charlie Hodge really encouraged me to be part of the American Council of the Blind. And I, obviously, by virtue of having graduated law school, having chosen that as a career, I knew I had developed special skills in the area of advocacy, and it was only natural that I advocate for the perceived self-interest of a group of which I was most definitely a part, namely the blindness community. And that advocacy really came to the fore when, in the state of Virginia, which actually led the government by 5 years, Virginia established the Virginia Department of Disabilities, or I forget what it's now called, I'm embarrassed to say, but we passed what you might call a little ADA. Yeah, the Virginians with Disability Act. I knew it was VDA. Virginians with Disability Act, the Virginia statute, I say our, though I'm in Arizona in retirement now, that statute, VDA, was passed 5 years before the federal statute. And I was pleased to have been among those who stood before the state legislature and argued very strenuously for passage of that legislation. And it was that advocacy that brought me to the attention of the incoming governor in 1986, Gerald Baliles. It was through that advocacy that I came to his attention, and he decided he wanted me for his commissioner of what was then the Virginia Department for the Visually Handicapped. But come to find out, skills in advocacy are not the same as skills in management, which I had none, and that caused me some trepidation. I told him that, but he said, "Oh, we'll work it out." Well, we tried to work it out.
What are some of the biggest challenges you faced as a visually impaired person, and how have you overcome them?
I think this question is the hardest for me to answer. I really don't know how to answer it because blindness and the challenges of blindness have always just been a part of my life, just like every person on this earth has challenges. I went to a school for the blind up through 8th grade, and I think that was a good model for me. You get an intensive exposure and immersion in the skills of blindness. So that worked out. And then having gotten that immersion, having gotten those skills, the only thing I needed in high school, well, not say the only thing, obviously I needed my texts provided in either audio format or Braille for mathematics and French is the language I took. So math and language, that'd be pretty critical. To have brailled the rather voluminous text for English and history would have been a bit much. I did those by audio. Mostly tapes from what is now Learning Ally. At the time, it was just known as Recordings for the Blind. But my mother did, and I owe her a debt that could never be repaid. My being mainstreamed and having done as well as I did would not have been possible, but for the amount of reading my mother did. She took about an hour, sometimes an hour and a half out of every day to record. I had a reel-to-reel tape recorder, and if there was a novel that was a sign that wasn't available from the National Library Service, for what's now the blind and print disabled, I think we call it now. But NLS, we all know what we're talking about. Mom did a lot of recording. That was a challenge, but the challenge really fell on those who supported my dreams, my aspirations, and really made them possible. So I don't look at myself as having faced insurmountable challenges. They were made surmountable by other people stepping up.
Wow, that's awesome. How has technology impacted your life, and are there any specific tools or devices that have been particularly helpful?
This podcast is being done in 2024, and it's past September of 2024. So do the math. I'm 70 years old. I lay that predicate out to say that technology didn't really become a factor in my life until the 50% mark. If we take 70, I hope I make it beyond 70. But my point is, it was half a lifetime ago that technology became a factor. I had dabbled the tiniest little bit. There was a course offered by the DC Lighthouse for the Blind District of Columbia in the Apple IIe, but I didn't do anything with technology until after the commissionership and about a year of basically gigs, being bounced around, getting whatever work I could. I signed on again with the federal government. I resumed the career of service I had with the federal government in June of 1990. And it was then that Social Security had what they called the STAR program for its blind and visually impaired employees. I think that was Special Technology and Resources. They had a cute acronym, but basically it was the era of the VERT Plus, for anybody who may know about that, the VERT synthesizer. And I spent the first month or 2 months, I would say 6 weeks to 2 months of my job. I really wasn't productive. They had trained people on this technology in 1989, so I was behind the class that had been trained on it. But I caught on fairly quickly, and boy, that seems so long ago, but it was DOS, obviously, not Windows. And I wrote decision memoranda for judges based on that technology. And when I saw how empowering technology was and was going to be, I just made it a point to keep abreast of it since the early 90s, from DOS and then Windows. I think my earliest version of JAWS was JAWS 3.7, and they've stopped that kind of nomenclature now. They just do it by year, as you know. But I think another thing that helped me, well, maybe not. I was going to say what helped me embrace technology or not be fearful of it was my interest in amateur radio, as you know. But I think with or without amateur radio, I would have been.
Oh yeah, for sure. You're right about that.
If you don't get yourself, if you're going to write decisions, people were writing. So, if you're going to write decisions, people are writing them using tech. Back then, it was WordPerfect 5.1, which I'm still very fond of. I didn't. WordPerfect 6.0 and 6.1 was an attempt to sort of come into the world of Word. When I started, Microsoft, aside from the operating system, didn't have the broad dominance it has now, but they developed Word, and that became the standard. And when I was the commissioner of the state agency for the blind in Virginia, I was very much in the mold of the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s executive. I would dictate things for my secretary to write. And they had like dedicated word processors. The computers only did, they were specially designed as word processors in and of themselves. I remember like DisplayWrite. I remember the name DisplayWrite. I never did it. It was just, here's the tape, transcribe it for me, read it back to me, we'll make corrections. And I was very much in that mode as commissioner.
Wow. Can you tell us about a memorable experience or achievement that you're especially proud of?
Well, I suppose the most obvious one would be graduating from Harvard Law School. There are, I dare say, only a relatively few number of blind people who could claim that. Of course, for some blind people, that might never have been an aspiration to be a lawyer, much less to try to make it in one of the most prestigious law schools. There again, I have the New York Commissioner for the Blind to thank for having supported me in that. I certainly didn't come from money. I'm obviously proud of that. I was proud of, and it's something I never set out to achieve as such. I always did the best I could. That was inculcated into me, certainly by my parents and by Lavelle School in my formative years. Whether it was said overtly or not, the message was always there that if you're blind, you really have to be better than the average Joe. While people can have mixed impressions about that, I think it remains the truth of the matter. And I don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with being encouraged to do your absolute best. If you look at the message in that context, like you have to be better than, the average person, that's really almost tantamount to saying the same thing as do your absolute best. And which I did, and which has served me well. Frankly, I'm also proud of how what I've been able to accomplish on the guitar. That's an avocational pursuit, and that story is kind of interesting. In 1963, when I was 8, for most of the year, 9 for the last quarter of the year, Peter, Paul, and Mary were all the rage, and I wanted to learn guitar in the worst way. And my mother scouted teachers in the neighborhood, but to their credit, they didn't want to rip my family off, but they didn't see how they could teach a blind person since all the teaching materials were obviously printed books. So I wound up taking classical violin lessons at the New York Lighthouse for the Blind from 1963 to 1969. And that, I'm glad I had that exposure to classical music and to studying violin for 6 years. But my point is this, that in 1966, I just happened to be tuning around the television dial, and on public television in New York, there was a show called Folk Guitar with Laura Weber. And there was no audio description back then, but she was so descriptive, and I could also tell what note she was playing by the sound. I had perfect pitch, but I would watch those shows religiously, and when I couldn't catch them live because of other commitments, my father would take the tape recorder I had and put a mic. There was no output jack on the television back then. He took a mic and shoved it in front of the speaker and turned it on and hoped that people were reasonably quiet in the background. I still have snippets of some shows on reel-to-reel tape, so I still have Laura Weber's voice memorialized. But that was the way I learned guitar. And like I said, that was a real icebreaker. But I didn't do it to gain social standing. It's just something deep in my soul that if I haven't played guitar in 2 or 3 days, check for a pulse. And I've done everything from folk to rock to bluegrass, where I switched over to mandolin. That was an easy switch because mandolin is nothing more than a plucked violin, if you think of it that way. It's a life skill that I thank God for. I didn't do anything to earn it. It was just a talent given to me, and I like to think I developed it, consistent with my other obligations. And I'm glad I never had to do it professionally. So when I've done it, I've always done it for the love of it and for the joy. Not that I haven't made some money playing in bars and stuff like that, but there was no pressure to do things that I wasn't really into musically to put food on the table.
Right, that's wonderful. What advice would you give to someone who is newly diagnosed with a visual impairment?
What I would tell them, and this may be difficult because there's a real divide between the ophthalmology community and the rehabilitation or blindness support community. This puts it a little crudely, I suppose, but once you get that diagnosis from the ophthalmologist, they don't do very much more than pat you on the head and wish you good luck. I mean, they're not that callous, but they don't really know the networks that might be available for assisting people. The VR system, if that's appropriate. But frankly, in a lot of cases, the sight loss is sufficiently late in life that maybe there doesn't need to be a high emphasis on returning to the workforce. I mean, if you're 62 and could get Social Security anyway, would you push hard to be in the rehabilitation system? And you wouldn't take the reduced benefit that you would get at 62. Blindness is a listing level disability. So once proof of blindness is established, they don't worry about age and vocational factors. In other words, they don't get to ask, well, we understand you're blind, but there are blind people who work. Why don't you try to get a job? They can't ask that. It's just the way the statutes and the regulations are written. So you would basically draw down almost full Social Security at that age in the hypothetical that I've just sketched. I would say seek out a support group, but there's a caveat to that. And I'm seeing it now as I help blind people, who have become blind later in life. There are support groups that are little more than gatherings of newly blinded people, and the sole topic of conversation is what's the miracle that's going to enable me to dodge this bullet? What's the latest scientific research? When will the miracle cure come? I can understand given how important sight is, how central it is to the normal human existence. Okay, I mean, sight's pretty important. I'll take that as a given, even though I never had it. I can understand a newly blind person's fixation on that aspect of things, but what that person also needs to understand is that miracle cure may not come in your lifetime. So how are you going to live your life now? What about getting the skills of blindness? And that's where I think more people like me, more congenitally blind people, need to be involved in these mostly older support groups for newly blinded individuals, because we have the skills of blindness, and God knows there's not enough support and not enough infrastructure from federal spending or state spending. There is a program for older blind, but it's so underfunded as to be ridiculous. People languish on waiting lists for like years. Years, it's probably a minimum wait. And by that time, depression is set in, which it probably will set in anyway when you lose such a central faculty as sight. But I think what people who are congenitally blind can do, assuming they have their act together and have been reasonably successful, they can, if only by their actions, if only by their example, say, look, blindness stinks. No one chooses it as an alternative, a freely chosen alternative lifestyle, but it's survivable. You can have a meaningful life even with this new challenge, and we have to grant that it is a formidable one. But you just have to rewire your thinking. You're going to do anything that you can do, just about everything that you will be able to do, you're going to do in a different way. And you do have to get to a place of acceptance about that. And if you spend 100% of your time dwelling on when the miracle cure is going to happen, that's going to take away bandwidth for the acceptance of what is and what you need to do to live a quality life with blindness at whatever level.
Yes, absolutely. How do you stay motivated and maintain a positive mindset despite the challenges you face?
Again, blindness has just always been a part of my life. So, that question sort of presupposes that I wake up with this crushing weight of, oh, I can't do this, or there are all these challenges, and I don't wake up with that. The things that I'm unable to do, like drive, I don't wake up saying, man, it really stinks that I can't drive. Well, that's been true ever since, teenage years when people normally get their licenses. And I knew that wasn't going to happen for me. Let's not talk about autonomous vehicles in this conversation. But so obviously, there's Uber, there's Lyft. My heart breaks for all the denials that have happened, from those or for those using guide dogs. I never chose to use a guide dog, so I don't face that, but I stand in full solidarity with those blind people who are being discriminated against because they use guide dogs. But, my wife will drive me places. 90% of the time we're going to the same place or doing the same thing anyway. Not that we don't have our own independent lives, but, I don't wake up with a overarching brooding sense of what I can't do because of blindness. I'm doing the things that I always have done, playing guitar, operating ham radio, advocating, keeping track of memberships for various organizations, keeping my technology skills sharp. I'm contributing, and I know that I'm contributing, and that's enough for me.
Yeah, that's great. Does Arizona have reliable public transit that you could use if you needed to?
Yeah, it does. I didn't mention we have Sunvan. Not really shocking that they would call it Sunvan, at least not in southern Arizona. I came here for the heat, and I jokingly say when the thermometer dips below 70, I reach for a parka. But I don't tolerate the cold nearly as well as I used to. The Tucson area does have a fairly decent paratransit. That's the word I'm looking for. Paratransit service available. It's a little more problematic when you have to interface with the county more broadly. which is one of the reasons I decided that I would definitely live in the city. I mean, there are some people who live on the outskirts of the city in Pima County, and Pima County has another or a parallel paratransit system, and they do work with Sunvan, but I can't say that I use it very much because, like I say, most of the time I'm having a sighted spouse, and if we do things together, I would just go with her. But for things that she's not interested in, I'll either use Uber if time is a factor, or I'll use Sunvan. I think most blind folks would agree that with the advent of computers and technology and OCR, optical character recognition, the inability to read the printed word is now really reduced to the level of a nuisance. But the significant challenge that yet remains is independence in transportation.
Right. Well, regarding reading things, the significant challenge that remains there, at least for me, is reading things that people have handwritten.
Oh, yeah. Well, sighted people always struggle with other people's handwriting. I am surprised that I'm very shocked, really, that the use of the typewriter didn't gain greater currency in the 50s and 60s and 70s. I mean, I know it looks nice and personal Emily Post would say that, as a matter of fact, the rule of etiquette always was that you should never type a thank you letter, and the only exception to that was disability. You can look it up in old etiquette manuals. Emily Post and that ilk. It was overtly stated that the only justifiable reason for writing a thank you notes, that being primary example, to type them would be is if you were physically unable to handwrite them. So
yeah, well, I can write.
But so many people struggle with handwriting. I'm saying how this, and I'm getting a direct exposure to this because my wife found a whole bunch of letters from her mom had saved, and her mom passed in December of 22. But there were a whole lot of letters from was it her brother? No, it couldn't have been her brother. Going up the chain from it would have been somebody significantly older than him. I don't know the exact relationship, but Harry Carson is the name, and he was in World War I, and he wrote all these letters home, and there were return letters, from those to whom he wrote, and Emily wants to transcribe all those, but so many times we're having to, put question marks or lines like, we're not sure what this says. So yeah, it was nice and personal, and I guess he didn't have access to a typewriter. Leave alone the fact that even into the 70s, boys weren't taught typing. That was a female thing. If you were going to be a secretary, it was seen as too menial. That if you were a male, you'd be an executive and you dictate or handwrite something, and hopefully your secretary would get used to your handwriting and they would type it. Typing was seen as a skill that was most fit for females and for females who were going to be secretaries. Okay. For blind people, we got typing in the fourth grade at Lavelle School for the Blind because that's I believe, and I'd like to research this, but I think the typewriter was developed by an Italian who wanted to give a blind countess a way to communicate. And it makes sense that you'd have a machine that would enable a blind person to type. You can type without even knowing what the letters look like. I know what capital letters look like. There's a lot of small letters. I couldn't even tell you what they look like, but that's immaterial. If I want to produce a capital G, I don't need to know what it looks like to press the shift down or the caps lock. I'm thinking in old terms with type bars and pressing the key for G. Don't need to know what it looks like. I know I typed a G, and the sighted person knows it's a G by what pops up on the screen.
Right. Well, I was going to say earlier that I can write, but nobody can read it. Like, my signature, for example. If I sign something,
Yeah.
I can sign my signature all day long, but nobody can read it. It just comes out as chicken scratch.
Yeah. Well, and my mother, like, put my hand through the motions of, I think people can discern my signature, but I think it's deteriorated over time. I got something from APH, and it wasn't raised, it was like grooved. It has all of the letters. So if you took a stylus, you wouldn't necessarily take a pen because you don't want to draw in it as such. But if you took a stylus and followed the grooves, you would be able to know how to make the letters. I can sign my own name. I don't know how legible it is, but heck, most doctors and lawyers have poor signatures anyway. And of course, I mean, the one thing that handwriting has to recommend it is that it is unique. I mean, there are people in law enforcement who are trained to be handwriting experts, and they do handwriting comparisons, you know. So handwriting is very unique, whereas any braille is a machine language. You have 6 registers. Let's forget about 8-dot braille for now. You got 6 registers, and the register is either on, which means you've pushed a dot, or it's off. You haven't pushed a dot, you know. So the letter J, you know, registers 1, 3, and 6 are not pushed, and 2, 4, and 5 are, you know.
Right, yeah.
It's a machine language, so there's nothing unique about it.
Absolutely. What changes would you like to see in society to better support visually impaired individuals?
Again, we've talked about how paramount technology is in empowering. I know it's an overused word, but in enabling blind people to be successful, certainly in employment settings and just in normal correspondence, just the other aspects, you know, these just social aspects of your life. How much of being social now is for better or ill, and I have mixed feelings about it, but you know, social media, that's the word I'm looking for, and being able to write emails and things of this nature. So I think, and this is why I'm in bits, it is absolutely imperative that the blindness community support and really, really push hard for websites to be accessible. Government websites for sure, and the government hasn't always been the best, but they're paying more. They're paying more attention to it. There's a new regulation. Let's hope it doesn't get watered down or canceled by the incoming administration. The Department of Justice, I think, is that just put out regulations that websites of local government, county, state, and local government have to be accessible. Depending on the size of the government, that's either 2026 or 2027. And we need to push for businesses to pay more attention to accessibility. You know, our money is as good as anybody else's money as blind persons. I guess aside from transportation, that's the biggest frontier. It's not enough for blind folks to have access to screen readers. You know, the screen readers aren't worth very much if the site is so hopelessly inaccessible.
Right. Take, for example, that site you told me about the other day.
Oh, yeah.
For looking up incoming call signs.
Yeah. I mean, it just really wasn't accessible.
Things like that need to be accessible too. Anything does.
They sure do. But of course, that's a private person just doing his own reorganization of data that's out there. So we're never going to be fully successful because, I mean, the broader society is not going to support something so draconian that a single individual working out of their basement, you know, looking to provide a service, you know, we're not, just like the ADA does not apply to businesses below a certain threshold of employees. So we push where we have the standing to push. You know, any business that has let's say 100, 200 employees. Accessibility, especially if you build it in from ground zero, is not all that hard to achieve. And the fact of the matter is that these businesses are basically outsourcing, and this is understandable, they're outsourcing their website development to external companies using CMS, content management systems. And it's those individuals who really need to be leveraged to be paying attention to accessibility. It's just like physical accessibility. And if you build it in from the bottom up, if you build it in from the outset, it really doesn't cost all that much more, as opposed to going in and having to retrofit, the time to re-engineer and basically redo things you've already done because you didn't pay attention to accessibility in the first instance.
Oh, wow. Absolutely. Can you discuss any projects or initiatives you're currently working on that aim to improve the lives of visually impaired people?
Well, yeah, actually, one comes very readily to mind that'll be a factor tomorrow. I have my own Zoom room. Really, I'm very, very privileged to enjoy a comfortable retirement. So paying $150 a year for my own Zoom room is not a stretch. And I don't use it all that often, but one of the things I use it for is, and we spoke about groups of older blind people, support groups, if you will. We have an organization here that's not aligned between the two major consumer groups, the American Council of the Blind and the National Federation of the Blind. It's called the Tucson Society of the Blind. And one of the things that we're doing is giving training to blind people on voiceover. So we have a very astute guy, very competent with technology, Manny Salas, and he the third Tuesday of every month, he has a 2-hour class, and I make my Zoom room available for that class. So that's what we do.
Are you yourself a part of that class then?
No, it usually conflicts with an amateur radio net, so I basically, thinking of it like a room, I'm the janitor. I shove the key in the lock, I open the room, I usher people into the room, I close the door, and I let them do their thing, and I enjoy it. Because most of the things he teaches, not everything by all means, but most of the things he teaches I'm already familiar with. So I kind of unlock the door, usher them in, close the door, and then put myself on mute and turn the volume down and go to the ham net. So if I catch the end of the meeting, that's fine. At opportunity, I always access the recording that's made of it. I mean, it's on my server, or it's on my Zoom platform, so I have access to the recordings.
Wow, that's incredible. How can people without visual impairments become better allies and supporters of the visually impaired community?
You know, I think I'm always leery of any contrived efforts to achieve that goal. I think by having blind people being out and about in the community, I have very, very mixed and not always positive feelings about things like Meet the Blind Month. I remember in the 70s and 80s, people were doing these things like simulating, and this drove me absolutely up the wall. Somebody would be asked to wear a blindfold for a day on Disability Awareness Day. Let's call it that. Maybe a college, university would have Disability Awareness Day. So some people were in wheelchairs and some people would have blindfolds. Guess what? When you put a blindfold on a sighted person, you don't create instant blind man. Doesn't happen. You know what you create? Instantly terrified, disoriented, sighted person. Putting a blindfold on somebody and saying, this is your life, this is what my life is like, is pure idiocy. An individual in that circumstance has none of the skills of blindness. They're just disoriented. They're instantly plunged into a world where they have no idea of how to do anything without sight, because again, sight's so central. I'll make this point even more strongly. My daughter in the 4th grade, I guess they were doing a module on disability, and so my daughter, I guess, made it known that she had a blind dad. Anyway, I was asked to do a presentation. And part of my presentation was to show them that a lot of what they would need to function if they didn't have sight, they already had, they just didn't use. And the example I used was like throwing a penny on the floor. I would throw a penny on the floor and I would go to where I'd last heard it make a noise and bend down. And usually I'd be very, very close to it where I didn't have to do a lot of groping around. I'd pick it up pretty quickly. And so I'd take somebody from the audience, that would be her classmates, and they'd put a blindfold on them. I'd drop a penny and they would be I'd give them 3 opportunities. The first time they went to get it, they were like clueless. The second time, they were in the ballpark. By the third time, they came about as close to putting their hand near the penny as I did. And so my point in doing that exercise was to say, you always had that skill to locate by sound. It's just trumped by vision. You see the car, before you hear the engine, but you hear the car engine. Your brain just discards that audio. You don't need it. It's trumped by vision. Now, again, I'm not saying this to advocate for blindness being a freely chosen alternative lifestyle. I'm just saying you use, and this goes to that canard about, blind people having special hearing. No, I think if you took the average blind person, average sighted person, both with hearing within normal limits, it's just a question of how we use our hearing, what we pay attention to, how we use our hearing.
Oh, exactly.
It's how we use it. You hear the same car engine I hear, I dare say. I mean, a sighted person, but, you're looking at the car. We have to listen for that car engine and make a judgment about speed, direction, whether it's slowing down. I mean, it would be better if we saw it, but that's not an option. So you hope they're obeying the rules of the road. That's a whole nother discussion with all the distractions that drivers have today.
Yeah. What are your hopes and aspirations for the future, both personally and for the visually impaired community as a whole?
Just to continue to be reasonably healthy until God calls me home. I tell you, my challenges now have nothing to do with blindness, or very little to do with blindness. They have everything to do with the fact that the skeletal structures aren't holding up to the extent that I would like them to. I had a hip replacement at the age of 53. I had 2 back surgeries, one in 2018 and 2021, and that's left me with mobility restrictions, and I'm having my other hip done, the right hip, on December 4th. So skeletally, I'm not doing that great. But my brain's still sharp, or reasonably so. I think it's tailing off a bit. But these things are inevitable, and I guess that's part of learning to age gracefully. I will continue to work to the best of my ability to advocate for the needs of blind people, to advance our legitimate self-interests in a society that I know inclusive is sort of a problematic buzzword today, but I think it fits. It would not take all that much to include us in the full panoply of human activities. I think the more that we're out there and about, like I talked before about my having very, very mixed feelings about contrived events to get people to accept us, or let's say not be fearful of us. As I often say to folks, it's not like leprosy. Blindness isn't catching. You won't catch it. I think the more that we're out there, the more that we're visible, it can only improve our situation. Blindness isn't that overarching defining thing. It is regarded as just, an aspect of who I am, to the point where somebody will say, well, look over there, it's going, and then they feel stupid. And I always make a joke out of it in that circumstance. Actually, that to me is when I feel that the person is really transited over to the fact that, they're not unaware of the fact that I'm blind, but they're not thinking about it constantly. So they will say something that would make sense to a sighted person. And I just encourage them to have a chuckle over it. I said, look, I know you didn't say that to be funny or cute. You've gotten to a point where you don't have this brooding, omnipresent sense of, oh, blind man, can't use the word see, can't use the word look, have to walk on eggshells. Where does that get us? Come on, I want people to feel comfortable with me. I understand it's not going to be instant because most people haven't interacted with a blind person. So there you are.
Yes, absolutely. What would you say is your greatest accomplishment and why?
Well, I think we sort of went through that, I guess, getting out of Harvard Law School, graduating, getting out. It felt like I was happy to get out. Boy, that was a bit of a grind. In the vocational sphere, obviously, I suppose it would have to be that. I'm not talking about my role as a dad. The marriage didn't survive, but, I have a beautiful daughter who gave me a grandson about 1 year and 4 months ago. To talk about being proud of that, well, that's something most people who want that manage to achieve it. But I hope, I've done well as a dad. And unfortunately, I don't know how close I'll really be able to be with my grandson since they're in New York City and I'm here in I'm here in Tucson. But when they can travel, blessedly they're doing pretty well, and I'm doing pretty well. I could certainly put something toward airfare. I would hope that they would come at least once a year. Once the first grandchild, and I'm pretty sure there'll be more. But all in good time. All in good time. What I'm proud of, and I'm also proud of my guitar work, and I'm proud of getting my extra class amateur license. We haven't talked too much about that. But I left the hobby. I was licensed as a novice in 1969. But in 1971, it was the up or out. You couldn't renew your novice license. It was a 2-year license. And I studied hard for the general, but then it was like senior year. I'm in a rock band. I'm going to go off to college. So I just walked away from the hobby, pretty much knowing it wasn't going to be forever. And during my college and law school years, at least 2 of the 3 law school years, I did walk away from the hobby. It was something I didn't have time for. But in my 3rd year of law school, I decided to get back in. And I took the novice, and I only had that license for about 4 days. I went in, got the general, and I got the advanced, and then on St. Paddy's Day of 1980, my extra class license. So that was an achievement that I'm proud of, and it's given me significant hours of enjoyment. I hope to see it give me more years of enjoyment in my retirement years, because I didn't have much time for it during my working years. Plus, I was in a condo, so doing HF work where you really need an outdoor antenna, not really going to happen when you're in that setting.
Right, especially if you were under an HOA.
Yeah, oh, well, if you're in a condo, yeah, that's like an Uber HOA,
Yeah. Yeah, well, I definitely have you to thank for helping me get into the hobby.
Yeah, well, how did you get into the hobby exactly? And I mean, you came to me when you realized I was a ham and that I could help, and I was happy to help. But what was your exposure to it?
So I had taken a class that was just for informational purposes when I was in high school. It was like an after-school program. It wasn't anything during the day. But my mom and I actually did it together. It was just like, here's ham radio, here's how it works, here's what it does.
Oh, great.
And at the time, I was like 14, and I was like, maybe, I don't know, I'll think about it.
Yeah.
And then in 2020, I joined the ACB, and I was listening to one of the ACB media channels. I forget which one. Probably Community. And I heard you and Jason and a whole bunch of other people just casually talking. And I think I somehow managed to get like an email address or something for you and reached out to you and said, hey, what is this? I want to get into it. And told you that kind of backstory, and then we just started studying together, and
Yeah,
I was
I wasn't aware of how you were exposed. Amateur radio was a big thing in the residential schools for the blind. Now, Lavelle School wasn't primarily residential. There were people who were residents there for all the weekdays, and they went home on the weekends because they were too far out on Long Island to where transporting them every day was really not an option. But Lavelle School was not residential in the same way that state schools are residential, and the kids go away on Labor Day and they don't come back till Thanksgiving and Christmas and Easter. That's pretty much it, unless you live real close and your parents want to pick you up. Obviously, New York City being as large as it is, had a sufficient population density so that there were enough blind people to make a day school environment viable. Not only in one instance, but there was also the New York Institute for the Education of the Blind. I think now they call it the New York Institute for Special Education, but it was New York Institute for the NYIEB, and they had a high school before Lavelle did. But I mean, there were two day schools for the blind with bus transportation being provided, to the majority of folks. But I mentioned that by way. Now, the New York Institute had a ham station. God bless Bob Gunderson was his name. He started Braille Technical Press magazine, which ran from March of 1950 to June of 1973. Lavelle didn't have a ham station when I was there, but you are in settings with other blind people, and amateur radio was big among blind people. Because it was something blind people could do. And it was, I don't want to say pushed, but if you had a ham license at a school for the blind, that really gave you status. It was like having a letter on your shirt, It's like a letter for track, a letter for football, something like that. It achieved that degree of status.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I got my tech when I was in college when my stress levels were to the max and I needed something to
there you go. Yeah.
ease my mind. And believe it or not, it worked.
Right. Jessica, I'm going to need to get going. This probably is a longer podcast than you bargained for. But
yes, it was great having you. And one last quick thing. If listeners want to contact you or connect with you, how can they do that?
Why don't just send me an email? That's the preferred method. John, John, at jamsite, JAMSITE. So think of jam, what you put on a sandwich, or a drink with jam and bread. What a tea, a drink with jam and bread. That kind of jam. Or if you're a musician, a jam session. JAM as in Michael, SITE.net. John at jamsite.net is a good email address for me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, John. It has really been a pleasure.
It has. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I was happy to be a part of your podcast, and I wish you every success with it going forward.
Thank you so much. And thank you to those who have subscribed to the podcast and downloaded thus far. Keep it coming.